I'm going to be reading from various bits of this book, Comply With Me, Trump's Hypnosis Toolkit Exposed. I struggled about how to end the book. Exposure is really what I'm doing, but in the nicest possible way. I just want as many people as possible to understand the techniques that are convincing so many people. So I'm starting at the beginning, and this is really what inspired me to write this book. It was a giveaway. It was the handshake that betrayed him, a clue so obvious that I couldn't believe the media hadn't picked up on it. Much discussed in newspapers and online, Donald Trump's handshake has been nicknamed the Trump pump and the bone crusher. Typically, it involves a strong-armed pull-push and takes considerable seconds to complete. As soon as he's within arm's length, Trump jerks his prey towards him, grasping their fingers hard while pulling them off balance. He follows through with a forceful push, causing the other to step backwards in surprise. You may have seen this. Analysts have explained these greetings as power moves, viewing them as a method for Trump to assert his authority, yet they're subtler than they appear and more effective than commentators realize. His handshake routines aren't identical. He rings the changes. Sometimes he pats the back of a person's hand. He might give a jerk sideways, or his left arm might extend to pull the person's right shoulder nearer towards him. When he met Putin, there was a two-handed grasp and no yank. The handshake was softer, but even so, Trump chose to pat the underside of Putin's forearm a couple of times. Trump had already employed a strange handshake several years before his launch into world politics. A variant of the technique was reported by Kathleen Turner, the actor who became famous in the 1980s. He goes to shake your hand and with his index finger kind of rubs the inside of your wrist. In her view, he was trying to do some kind of seductive intimacy move. You pull your hand away and go, yuck. Trump's handshake routine is not original. It is a classic hypnosis confusion procedure aimed at putting people into trance quickly. I spotted it immediately because I teach it. The key is to shake someone's hand and then break the expected routine by doing something different. The person whose hand you're shaking becomes confused and disorientated for a moment. At that point, mutter something softly like, relax now, or sleep, and watch as their head drops down, or perhaps their eyes close. You can try it yourself on an unsuspecting friend. It won't work if they know you're going to employ a handshake interrupt, of course. The element of surprise is key. You might not be successful at first, but it could work a treat. So that's how I began, the handshake. And then I started to look at what else he was doing. More than his touch. There is a common misconception that inducing hypnosis in someone is down to what you say and how you say it. Not true. A good hypnotist can put someone into a trance without saying a word. They use their body, their breath, their eyes, and not to be undervalued, their total conviction that trance will occur. Hands. Trump does several subliminal tricks with his hands. His thumb-touching, index finger gesture while giving speeches is also a hypnotic device. The O made by the thumb and forefinger acts to focus the eyes of the audience. As they track the moving circle, the crowd glazes. With the audience's conscious attention on his fingers, any suggestions that Trump makes are more likely to bypass their rational mind and be accepted and absorbed. Ostensibly a gesture signifying all is okay, there is an alternative interpretation. This O sign was claimed as a white supremacist symbol, the three fingers supposedly standing for W, as in white, and the thumb and index finger representing P for power. the white supremacist meme was spread by 4chan, which is a mischievous website, which flooded the internet with it and then announced that it was a hoax. This hoax story didn't reach everyone, and since then, suspected racists have been filmed using it. Dig around on the web and you'll find that the gesture only gained this sinister meeting from 2016. Trump has been using it for longer. When speaking on the podium, Trump brings his arms together and moves them apart again, rhythmically, with both palms facing each other. The hands don't touch, yet they come towards each other, yet somehow tantalizingly always remaining apart. It is mesmerizing just focusing on these arms as they move in a rhythm back and forth, in and out. Once you look at these movements as the result of hypnosis training, they make sense. Even if Trump's audience consciously thinks his hand and arm movements are peculiar, it does not stop their unconscious minds absorbing his messages. Touches. Politicians like to touch as a power play. They jockey at doors, straining to be the last through so they can guide the other with a controlling hand in the small of their back. Trump's touches are different. They aim to gain consent to the suggestions he makes. Research on ways to touch people reveals that if someone is touched with artful skill, they become more compliant and likely to agree to requests. A successful touch is fingertip light, barely perceptible, and ideally delivered to the outside of the upper arm. When giving this touch, it's important the toucher simultaneously looks into the eyes of the receiver. Research shows that 2 touches are more likely to achieve agreement to a request. Trump is often shown patting someone's hand or arm twice. He doesn't touch someone once or give 3 taps, it's 2. I conclude that he knows this helps him achieve compliance. Putin and Kim Jong-un have both been recipients of his double tap. Eyes. A question. Trump is known to be vain, so why hasn't he masked the white circles around his eyes with tan makeup? The truth is that they are important tools in his hypnosis armory. The contrasting whiteness of Trump's eyes draws people to stare at them. Trump's eyes are small. He rarely opens them wide, and they're partly hooded by heavy lids that disguise the nature of his gaze. Watch Trump talk at rallies and notice that his eyes rarely, if ever, look clearly at anybody. It's only with his family, and particularly with his daughter Ivanka, that he looks straight into their eyes. To be successful at inducing trance in someone, a hypnotist must become adept at looking with what we call soft eyes. When someone looks into unfocused eyes, they mirror the gaze and glaze over in response, like Mowgli did when Kaa, the devious snake in Jungle Book, stared at him. Voice. Listen to Trump. His voice is even-toned. It has no edges. You could call it smooth, like brown suede. Trump has a regular rhythm in his speeches. You can hear the stress coming and going, not necessarily in sync with the meaning of the words that he is speaking, more like the flow of wavelets moving back and forth on a shore. His delivery rocks, lulling listeners into a dreamy state. Hypnotists work to develop a comforting, compelling rhythm so their clients move gently into a relaxed state. A technique Trump uses, especially when delivering a prepared speech, is to drop his voice at the end of each sentence in tone and in volume. It makes listeners glaze, and they can drop into a hypnotic state quickly. Try talking to a friend, dropping your voice at the end of each sentence. Watch how they respond. So if you're still with me, I'm going to talk a bit more about excerpts that reflect hypnosis happening in the USA and in the UK at the moment. This is from later in the book. A dead cat lying on the table. If people are told not to see something, they have to see it first before they can make any attempt to erase it. You cannot ask someone not to do something without them considering doing it. Mums know this instinctively. Tell a child not to put their finger in the candle flame, and they're likely to stick their finger out to try. They do this not because they're naughty, but because the word not is a word of lesser importance in their unconscious mind than the key words in the sentence. This principle governs how hypnotists talk to people who want to give up addictions. We don't mention the addiction, e.g. smoking, because immediately brain cells fire and produce smoking images in our mind's eye. Instead, we find other descriptions of their desired behavior. Not smoking becomes tobacco-free. A campaign aimed at football fans, No Room for Racism, might not have hit its mark. It's likely to be much less effective in communicating to the unconscious minds of their real target audience, the people whose minds need to change, than of the fans who already agree that racism is abhorrent. Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, describes the president using a classic hypnotic suggestion where a no would have been ignored by the listeners, in this case Cohen's unconscious mind. It was understood as business as usual, a business as usual. In written testimony, Cohen claimed, "At the same time I was actively negotiating in Russia for him, he would look me in the eye and tell me there's no business in Russia, and then go out and lie to the American people by saying the same thing. In his way, he was telling me to lie." We cannot be in the room with the two men observing Trump's eye movements, the marking of an embedded command by a physical movement, a micro lift of an eyebrow, a blink of an eye at the phrase, business in Russia. On paper, Trump states his lack of involvement. Cohen understood his boss's message. Unless he was mistaken, a trained observer of hypnosis would have spotted subliminal cues to mark the suggestion that Trump's business in Russia be continued. Michael Cohen might be considered an unreliable witness, given that he's now in jail, yet evidence in the impeachment inquiry supports the truth of Cohen's characterization of the Trump style. A parade of witnesses corroborated that Trump asked the Ukrainian president to investigate his opponent, Joe Biden, before he would send him the military funds. Even so, Republican defenders were able to protest that there was no evidence that Trump had demanded that investigation. It was Hitler who proposed using what is known as the big lie as a tactic to convince the masses. If the lie were colossal, people would never believe that it could have been made up, despite their doubts about it. Even after the truth was established, a trace of that big lie would still linger and retain some influence. It would impact the deep emotional core of people rather than their conscious minds. The big lie theory helps explain how people hold on to beliefs that are daft. It explains how Trump's big lie, the Obama birther campaign, where he claimed that Obama hadn't been born in the USA, still has its proponents, including a Jewish friend of mine. She also assured me that Obama was a Muslim. This belief, claimed on certain Jewish websites and perhaps heard at synagogue, was firmly held, despite online pictures of his church wedding, details of his family baptisms, him attending churches, and even leading the singing of Amazing Grace. One hell of a cover. So the current king of falsehood has to be Donald Trump. Lying is second nature to him, Tony Schwartz, his ghostwriter, claimed. More than anyone else I have ever met, Trump has the ability to convince himself that whatever he is saying at any given moment is true, or sort of true, or at least ought to be true. A lie is justified in hypnosis if it achieves the client's goal. It's a form of misdirection and part of the toolkit of stage hypnotists. Boris Johnson has long been known for lying, the accusations dating back to when he was a journalist at the start of his career. In 2019, prior to the general election, the Daily Mirror newspaper listed 60 of his lies, the earliest from 1991. Lie 60 on the list was Johnson's claim that he has never told a lie. In 2013, Johnson described a strategy taught to him by Sir Linton Crosby, an Australian consultant to right-wing political parties. Throw a dead cat on a table. Useful when losing an argument. If you throw a dead cat onto a table, everyone will shout, "Geez, mate, there's a dead cat on the table." Whatever else is happening is forgotten, as all they can talk about is the dead cat. Consider what the response would be if someone slapped the biggest island in the world on the table, when the world press could be writing about the suicide of your paedophile friend Epstein, several mass shootings, and your bid to bring Russia into the G7 group of countries after a hush-hush explosion at one of their nuclear missile bases. How diverting it would be to suggest buying Greenland. Not content to leave the dead cat there, Trump cancelled his visit to Denmark because they wouldn't consider his offer. A professor of philosophy recently identified what he calls vices of the mind. One of them is not caring if something is true or false. He gave this trait an academic label, epistemic insouciance, or in plain English, not giving a fuck about facts. Donald Trump has given an insouciant treatment to trade figures, historical incidents, legal judgments, the Mueller report, accusations of sexual impropriety, conversations with world leaders, and other topics too numerous to mention. Lying creates confusion in the mind of the receiver. We know that creating confusion is a useful tool if you want to put someone into a trance. What does the brain do with a lie? The brain is doing its best to adapt to the false reality that has been suggested to it and loses touch with what is real. Under this pressure, it can retreat into trance as a protection from the perils of uncertainty. On the other hand, research reveals that the more a person lies, the more their brain adapts to the lies. They become desensitized to their own dishonesty, and their lies grow bigger. Another section about the sincerest form of flattery, which some of you may know was a quote from Oscar Wilde. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Adolf Hitler's speeches were full of strong emotion and the repetition of key phrases, the foundation stones of any hypnotic speaker's technique. These skills didn't come naturally to Hitler. A hypnotist, Hanneson, trained him in how to speak to crowds. Look at Hitler's own description of his conduct on the reoccupation of the Rhineland. "I follow my course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker." Does it remind you of anything? Being in a walking trance, if you ask me. Ivana Trump, a former wife, claimed that Donald had a copy of Hitler's book, My New Order, a compilation of his speeches from the beginning of his rise to power up until 1939, in his bedside cabinet. Though Ivana said he read the speeches from time to time, Trump claimed that it was a Jewish friend who had given him a copy of Mein Kampf and that he didn't read speeches anyway. The friend who gave him the book, who said he wasn't Jewish, corrected that claim. The book he had given him was indeed My New Order. The journalist who broke the story of Trump's bedtime reading wrote that those Hitler speeches reveal Hitler's extraordinary ability as a master propagandist. Boris Johnson easily compares with Trump in his understanding of the role emotion plays in convincing people. You could argue that Johnson has often failed to convince because he's too fond of his own erudition, as demonstrated in this speech as Foreign Secretary. "It's not about returning to some autarkic 1950s menu of spam and cabbage and liver. It's about continuing the astonishing revolution in tastes and styles, in the arts, music, restaurants, sports that has taken place in this country in my lifetime, not so much because of our EU membership, that is to commit the fallacy known in the FCO as post hoc ergo propter hoc, ... He doesn't help his listeners by translating this Latin, and you might guess that he loses his audience at this point, but that doesn't matter. Unconsciously, they are absorbing a suggestion that Johnson is well educated. Their collective thought bubble, if only we could see it, containing the words, "Oh, he is clever." This could be an example of Johnson using a hypnotic confusional technique to lull his audience into a compliant trance state. Surely, Boris is not the type to bother acquiring such skills. He seems too convinced of his own abilities to consider such persuasion techniques to be necessary. Here, Johnson talks at a Conservative Party fringe meeting about the Labour Party. They want to spend literally hundreds of billions renationalising the utilities. They want to clobber business with new taxes, with workers' Soviets on the board. They would wreck the economy. They would drive away investment, and they would consign the population to years of further tedium, rancour and uncertainty, as if the last 3 years were not enough, by promising another Brexit referendum, another one. As Brenda from Bristol would put it, we cannot, we must not, and will not let this weaselly cabal of superannuated Marxist and Hugo Chavez admiring anti-Semitism condoning Kremlin apologists anywhere near the government of this country. Brilliant at stirring up fear of the other and full of metaphors, Johnson is communicating to the emotional, unconscious minds of his listeners. His use of numbers, as in hundreds of billions, is also artfully vague. His speaking style, a form of spontaneous word association, evokes trance. He also has considerable skill at creating rapport, triggering laughter in his audience to disarm and bring them on side. Even though he appears to be naturally, and for some, endearingly shambolic as a speech giver, this may be a ruse. We know for certain that Johnson studied hypnotic speech making. How? Because he wrote about it. Johnson's biography of his supposed role model, Winston Churchill, published while he was Mayor of London, goes into hypnotic techniques in some detail. He analyses Hitler's speaking style and refers to the Nazi leader's methods as having a hypnotic quality. Johnson observes, first the long, excruciating pause before he speaks, and then see how he begins so softly with his arms folded and how he uncoils them as his voice starts to rise, and then the awful jabbing fluidity of his gestures perfectly timed to intensify the crescendos of his speech. He describes Hitler's use of language and then claims that former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair copied it. Listen to the way Hitler brings them all to their collective climax with short verbless phrases, grammatically meaningless but full of suggestive power. It was to become a highly influential technique, copied among others by Tony Blair. At the least, Johnson knows enough about hypnosis to detect signs in Hitler and Tony Blair's speaking styles. Now we can identify his habitual waffling as a Boris version of hypnotic fluff. It works, though Twitter critics were infuriated by it. Waffle, waffle. I have no idea what Boris Johnson was talking about, and I don't think he did either. A new breed of populist leaders is winning favour in countries around the world, and they're basing their appeal to voters on emotions, using negativity to foment distrust of outsiders as well as of their opponents. The professional and public servant classes. I cannot judge if politicians from non-English speaking countries are using hypnosis, but there will be many leaders and aspiring politicians in the world who have watched Trump closely and learned. Do not assume that it's only the right wing that uses these techniques either. There was also criticism of Barack Obama's use of persuasive language, and he was suspected of being trained in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which is an offshoot of hypnosis. Here's Obama using biblical-style rhetoric at an election rally. A light will shine down from somewhere. It will light upon you. You will experience an epiphany. And you will say to yourself, I have to vote for Barack. Obama's grandiose sequence is a form of yes set. He speaks in the style of an evangelical preacher, building momentum to get the audience nodding in agreement, saying to themselves, yes, a light did shine down on me. It will light upon you. Yes, that's what lights do. You will experience an epiphany. Oh yes, I'd love that to happen. And finally convinced, okay, that clinches it. I will vote for Barack. Spotting manipulation, which is really why I wrote this book in the first place. Thinking that we can ignore hypnosis and NLP is like imagining that we can put the genie back in the bottle. Banning it is impossible. Hypnosis is a natural state of mind and also a form of communication that has been used either deliberately or by chance to convince others for thousands of years. We have to make an informed exploration of the power of hypnosis to access deep emotions because it can and does change the world. Neuroscience is discovering that something happens to our brains when we're in a trance. If we keep ignoring hypnosis, we give the people with that knowledge license to bamboozle, confuse, and if they get their way, control the global dramas that are involving us all. Examples of hypnotic manipulation are peppered throughout this book. Study hypnosis and NLP for yourself, and you will find many variants on those that are mentioned here. Obvious pointers to look out for are repetition, especially of chants, slogans, and rhymes. Confusing figures of speech that catch your attention but which don't appear to make sense. Rhythmic speech tones that lull you and exaggerated facts that sound too good to be true. Be alert for large numbers masquerading as statistics and unimaginably vast amounts of money. Be aware of questions that stimulate you to agree with them, especially when they appear as a series. British advertising for brands, products, companies and organisations has by law to be legal, decent, honest and truthful. The Advertising Standards Authority, the ASA, has banged this message home. It has a well-developed code of practice. As a consequence, the British public expects advertisements to be legal and truthful. But political parties are not held to account in the same way that a bag of crisps might be. Only allowed to use party political broadcasts on TV and radio, they have free rein in posters, pamphlets and the web. The ASA has no power here. The British population has long had an unconscious expectation that what they see and hear advertised by authoritative political and government sources is to be believed. That trust has been eroded. It can be fun working out how people are trying to persuade you. Just because someone understands how communication techniques are used to convince you doesn't mean they are bad. It's the content of the message that is the issue, not the delivery that you need to judge. As far as possible, check the message is based on fact. Be alert to any information that surprises you. If it is unlikely or shocking, be suspicious. Do I think that Trump's reluctance to wear a face mask is to do with the possible interruption of his hypnotic strategies? I do think that the face mask makes him feel weak, and it means he can't actually sort of whisper and gain rapport. The pandemic is the worst thing that could have happened to a man who wants to get within breathing distance of the people he wants to convince. He wants to lean in when he shakes their hand, sort of overwhelm them by his glamour, and then drop in a little suggestion. How does he adapt himself by Twitter? To hypnotise. Nice one. Thank you. He the thing about Twitter is that he sets the mice running, doesn't he? He just drops the bait and everybody chases after it. So he's able to use misdirection, which is a hypnotic technique. He's putting the dead cat on the table. And then Twitter is alight with denials and thousands and thousands of opinions. It doesn't matter to Trump. He's got your attention, and he's got your attention in an area that has nothing to do with what he's really up to. In the same way that Boris has recently said that the care homes, he's fluffed along being very vague about how the care homes didn't really do what they were supposed to do, despite the fact, of course, that they weren't given any PPE and that the guidelines were so vague in the beginning that they weren't really sure what they ought to do. But Boris has set the cats in Twitter, chasing the mice and the cats, whatever the animal is, the metaphor that comes, the birds are all tweeting, that's what they're doing. And meantime, you have to ask yourself, what are they doing that they don't want you to notice? Because while we're all focusing on care homes and we're not noticing maybe the billions of pounds of debt we're going into, or the lack of testing, I don't know. So that, I hope that answers that, Thomas. Teresa, how would I define hypnosis? Well, there are two things. There's the act of hypnotizing someone, and that is, and also there's the act of being in a hypnotic trance. So it's two sides of the equation. The best hypnosis is when you hypnotize yourself. The best hypnosis is when you hypnotize yourself because you're doing it on your own terms, and it's a really enjoyable thing to do. Hypnosis is slipping into the part of your mind which connects with the unconscious mind. It bypasses your critical faculty. It's a bit like meditation in as much as you don't think very much, but hypnosis is purposeful. You can use hypnosis to help yourself come to decisions, have creative ideas, feel less anxious, feel more relaxed. There are all sorts of ways that hypnosis can help you. It's a slowing of the brain waves. That's another way of defining it. And when you've been in hypnosis, it's one of the most pleasurable feelings that I think you can have. And it's what turned me onto it, really. And I didn't stop. And I began going into a hypnotic trance on purpose, because we all go into hypnotic trances when we're glazing, sort of driving. They're very light ones, though. But I probably had my first hypnotic trance in 1992. So there. Yes, there's more about it in the book. Okay, what about his hair? Thank you, Sheila. Now, the hair, I think, is inherited from his mother, because he would have sat and watched her in a trance as a little boy, entranced, we would say, by her backcombing as she sat at her vanity, as they call it in America, her dressing table. And if you look at old photos of Mary McLeod, Mary Trump, she had huge, huge bouffant and a sort of tsunami wave of gossamer-like golden hair held up by lots of Elnet or whatever the American hairspray is. And I think Donald learned that that was the way to cover his bald pate. From Drusilla, does Boris's technique only work when he's in control and being fairly humorous? Is he as good at it as Trump? Sometimes now you can see him getting angry with Starmer, and like a mask slipping, he just looks nasty. Yes, Trump can look nasty too. Yeah, Boris at the dispatch box is using artful vagueness, and he can't pin him down. It's like pinning jelly to a wall. And Keir Starmer is finding out how unwilling he is to be caught by any fact whatsoever. I think you're right. I think Trump is the past master. I think Trump actually learnt properly. Probably only over a couple of days, but I reckon he got trained by maybe Richard Bandler or one of the main NLP people. He also watched Tony Robbins in action because he spoke at one of his workshops, big, you know, sessions where they have hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands probably in those days. So I think Trump has had more years at it. But I do think Boris is a great fluffer and liar, as his Eton reports seem to demonstrate. He's just learned a few tricks from people like Linton Crosby. Any thoughts on the relationship between conspiracy theories on the rise with politicians using hypnosis? I'm not really sure what you mean there, Eliza. The far right is doing a lot of conspiring. QAnon particularly is one of their repeated, watch repetition. And if anybody says, do the research on something you claim, then they will have learnt that phrase, I think, from the far right. It's their sort of, their response to any claim that they make that you disagree with. They just say, do the research, and they're doing a lot of repetitive conspiring. Any thoughts about the use of slogans for coronavirus? 3 parts. Yeah, 1, 2, 3 always works. But that comes from rhetoric, of course. The ancient Greeks knew about that. Yeah, they got vague, didn't they? Didn't they go wonderfully vague after Dominic Cummings went off to the north, to County Durham, and made sure, though, that he danced to ABBA in the garden, so he was spotted, and also wore his trademark beanie when he went to Barnard Castle. So he wanted to get caught in order for them to fulfill their let's spread this virus as far as we can and achieve herd immunity as quickly as possible strategy, is my view. But, you know, that's up to you. You make up your own mind. And be alert, absolutely brilliant. Vagueness, so vague that I can't remember the other two in that section, but be alert was the one that struck me as artful vagueness. If you want to send someone inside their heads, then be terribly vague, and they have to go inside and think about what you've said and decide for themselves what you mean. And in that way, they own what they do. And in that way, the government have positioned themselves in a fabulous, place to accuse the population of Britain, or England principally, because they're the ones getting most of this artful vagueness. They can blame them for disobeying very vague guidelines. So they've set themselves up for a win-win, and we're in a blame position. I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and do tell your friends. And if